Hi, and welcome to this lecture on brands and selling from the shelf in the store. This lecture will be about the very sort of basic algorithms of or behind the planograms, and we've talked a lot on Monday. We talked a lot about system 1 and heuristics and the driving forces of nudging, how you can nudge people to buy more. This lecture will be all about that, sort of the core understandings of space elasticity and well, how to create the selling shelf. This is of importance for a brand manager, brand strategist, from a couple of perspectives. One is that even if you work hard and pay a lot to get the right brand associations, this can become severely damaged, or your job can be severely damaged unless you understand the job of the store and the shelf. So basically, as we said on Monday, 2/3 of all purchase decisions are influenced in the store. And for instance, if you have a new brand, I've done a lot of studies on if you have a totally new package, everything, you worked in focus groups to ensure that all the brand associations are communicated via the packaging and everything. And then we've seen that if you take a new package, totally new product, and put it on the top shelf, it'll work fine. If you put it on the bottom shelf, it will not sell at all. At the same time, if you have a discount label or a brand or a fighting brand of some kind, you need to put it down on the shelf, lower down. Otherwise, it won't do any good. So there are a number of aspects like that we'll go through. So you need to understand that actually, at least for fast-moving consumer goods, or consumer packaged goods, you can have a stronger effect on your brand associations depending on how you display it in the store than you can get with the help of TV adverts, for instance. Of course, everything is depending on the price, but at least when it comes to investments, there are sort of a typical character for a typical brand. Then you can have an even stronger effect on your brand associations by simply displaying the product correctly in the store. Okay, so here I'm going to go through a lot of sort of the basic stuff. I will be rather quick. This is chapter 3 in the book In-Store Marketing. So it's the selling brand, the selling assortment, I think that chapter is called. And it's the chapter contains basically all studies on shelf management and planograms. So enjoy. Okay, so in the store, you can see the brand as a reminder, the brand as an influencer, and the brand as an inspiration. What I mean by that is basically that often those are the driving forces behind impulse buying. And remember the model that we talked about during the live lecture earlier today, where you have the short-term or working memory in the middle. Now we're going to talk about the green blinking arrows, the ones that you can work with to ensure that your brand is paid attention to. Okay, first some early studies, and first we need to talk a little bit about a formula or a model called space elasticity. Actually, space elasticity is the increased sales that you expect from increasing the space of your brand. So if you have, this is Julie's book, if you have one facing like this, and you double the number of, or the visibility of the product, the average increase in sales will be 20%. So the average space elasticity is 20%. The average price elasticity, perhaps you've heard about that, is you expect it's minus 2.1. So if you have a decreased price, if you lower the price with 10%, you expect the sales to go up 21% on average in fast-moving consumer goods. So here you can maintain your margin, but you will increase the sales with 20% if you just double the space. This should not be confused with space productivity. Space productivity is sales per square meter or gross margin per square meter, another very well-known or well-used metric in selling or mechanical selling. But space elasticity is what you expect to get when you just double the space. And this is behind a lot of the studies on, or planograms, and studies on how to improve shelf management. This is one of the very first published papers on space elasticity, and here they had tested hominy, and as you can see, they used I put this chart in here because it's a good example also of the kind of experimental design that you need to work with when you work with field studies. You need to use something called Latin square design, meaning that, like in this case, you have 6 different manipulations. You have anywhere between 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and 14 facings of this hominy. And if you have 6 manipulations, then you need to test it over 6 weeks, and you need to test it in at least 6 stores. So if you look at week 1, for instance, you have all the different combinations of number of facings present in one store during that period. And if you look at store 1, horizontally, you can see that in store 1, all the different variations of number of facings will be tested in each store. So by doing this, when you collapse the model, you can compare 4 facings to 6 facings to 8 facings and so on in a very reliable way, because otherwise you would suffer from seasonalities and that different stores behave differently. Seasonalities is what you get when, for instance, when it's payday, people buy more and differently than the week before they get their monthly pay. So you need to, whenever you do field studies or buy field studies from someone, you need to make sure that they use Latin square. And I think when it comes to this, if you're a brand manager and if you want to do proper testing of where your brand stands in competition, you should make sure that you use field studies, and you should make sure that they know what they do, so they use Latin square design. If they don't do that, if they work with simple experimental designs with pre-tests and after-tests, it simply doesn't work. I was at a big summit with one of the leading global brands in London a couple of years back, and they wanted to compare the best sort of ways to display their brands. They wanted to compare, so they'd been competing, all the different countries had set up or had done the best they could, and then during this summit they displayed what they'd done and which results they'd gotten. And there was one country, I think it was Poland, who won, and this was a chocolate brand, and it was so strange because they'd done a nice display, they'd done a nice job in the store and everything, but you know, they had the treatment period that was during Easter, and of course people buy more chocolate during Easter. So even if they got enormous results, I think they increased sales with, I don't know, 2,000% or something like that. I mean, it's impossible to tell how much of that was because of the display and how much was because of the seasonality. So the only really good way of ensuring that you get the results that you want is to work with a Latin square design such as this one that Cox did. And what Cox found was that of the 4 brands that he tested, he actually only got a result for one of them. And as you can see, he can see sort of a steady increase, even though it goes down a bit for the 14 phases, but it's a steady increase between, or more or less steady increase between 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. Whereas for the bicarbonate, the Tang, and the Cremora, he doesn't find any results. So, okay, he didn't give up. He wanted to sort of prove his point. So in the second study, he said, well, there are 2 factors that need to be taken into account. One is that the product category has to be somewhat impulsive, and it has to be a strong brand. So in this case, he said that coffee milk could be sort of an impulsive product. Salt will not be impulsive. Doesn't matter how many facings you give to salt. People will only eat a limited amount of salt, buy a limited amount of salt. But then it also has to be a big brand. So if you increase the space for a not so strong brand, then it doesn't matter, because it will not lift the sales anyhow. And actually what he found was that his hypothesis was supported in this case. You can see that for the 2 salt brands, the 2 lower rows, you didn't see any increases, even though he had a third, half, or 2/3 of the shelf devoted to that brand. And in the coffee milk category, it's only the strong brand that gets an effect, where it's increasing almost proportionally to the increase in sales, whereas the weaker brand remains the same, independent of size. So Cox concluded from these early studies that the category must be impulse sensitive and the brand must be known or sort of performing well. And this has been incorporated in most of the planograms or planogram software that companies use. And I should perhaps mention that planograms are used by basically all brands. Basically all companies with brands have planogrammers who work with planograms that they try to help retailers with. So Coca-Cola would have it, Heineken would have it, Carlsberg would have it. They have planograms, and when they go to a retailer, they have a suggestion for what the shelf should look like. It used to be that this was called category management, and you had a category captain, so each retailer selected one brand to be the category captain in each category. But I think the distrust from the retailers, they didn't trust the brands to be neutral, so therefore, well, that was one of the reasons why a lot of the category management projects never really came to, prove what they could. But it's still the case that brands have shelf planners and stores have shelf planners. So this kind of knowledge is something that's important for anyone working with brands, independent on if you work on the retail side or the brand side. It's important that you have these sort of algorithms that with you, so you understand why planogramming is important, and you understand the basics for how it's working. Okay, then we have this study, Kotzan and Evanson, who found that not all products are space elastic. For instance, hemorrhoid medication, it doesn't matter how much space you give it. People only buy it if they have problems with it. But you can see in their case, both the toothpaste and the bandaging and the mouthwash was found to be at least somewhat elastic. Here is Frank and Massy, and they concluded that stores that already have a good market, or that already sell a lot of a product, in those stores, those brands that sell a lot will be more price sensitive or space sensitive, sorry. And this is something that has been shown over and over in different ways, that it's much easier to sell even more in a store or in a display that's already working than to try to start a store that's not working well, that's not selling well, to start to get them to sell a lot. So this, I think, when you are trying to optimize your efforts to sell, independent on what specific circumstances you are in by the time that you make that decision, remember that it's always more easy to, even if you have really high sales somewhere and really low sales somewhere, you don't necessarily need to see it as a gap, so that it's you think that it would be easier to catch up in the bad markets. It's often easier to sell even more in the already good markets. So that's sort of a very important, I think, learning to take away from this Frank and Massy. They also showed that the height, the shelf level, is important for space elasticity. So at eye level, space elasticity is much greater than, for instance, at the lower levels of the shelf. And then Curhan, he wrote his doctoral thesis at Harvard in 1972, where he looked at a lot of different studies, or basically all the studies that he'd found so far on space elasticity. And he concluded that there was a lot of variance. Some studies didn't find any elasticity, and some found great elasticity. But on average, the space elasticity was 20%. As I said, when you double the number of facings, you expect an increase of 20%. And he also said that if you adapt the shelf if you optimize the shelf, if you adapt it to the market shares, meaning that you look at the shelf what it is in one shot, or like what it is right now, and then you change it so it fits the market shares for the brand. So for instance, if Coke has 40% of the market, you devote 40% of the shelf to Coke, but now they only had like 20% or so. If you do that, the average adjustments would mean that you would increase or decrease, you would move around 40% of the brands. And then if you take a change of 40% and you know that the space elasticity is 20%, then you'll get an increase, a lift of 8%. So, and this has actually been found in, this is what you expect when you rearrange a shelf. You expect the long-term lift. The immediate lift will be greater, but after half a year, you expect the increased sales to have established at around 8%. So this is when you hear someone coming to you, approaching you, talking about this fantastic finding that they have, that if you only do this and that, it's so much better because it will increase the sales with 8%. You will know that this is expected. This is actually what you get on average when you just adjust the shelf to be in line with the market shares. In the Curhan paper, he found that store brands are more sensitive, and that some categories, like unplanned categories, are more sensitive. I would like to add two things to that. I think store brands have, in some studies, turned out to be more sensitive. In some studies, turned out to be less sensitive. But I think that the common denominator in all those cases where it's been successful is that it's been a brand that's already selling well. So a store brand that's not selling well, if you give it more space, it will not work. But if you have a store brand that has a sizable market share and you give it more space, then it'll work. I've seen both. I've seen lousy store brands, when they are given more space, it will collapse the entire category. But I've also seen well-selling store brands, and we give those more space, it works fine. And the unplanned categories is more sensitive. Unplanned categories could be sensitive, and they could also be not so sensitive. It depends on the penetration. So there are a lot of products that are perhaps not so easy to plan or not so often planned, but they have a great penetration, meaning that a lot of people buy them, not so frequently, but they buy them. It could be chocolate, could be I don't know, whatever you buy not so frequently, but that you still, they have a lot great penetration. And the key behind if it's successful or not is that the penetration is good. Okay, so some takeaways. Some categories are more space elastic than others. Well-known brands are more space elastic. Stores with higher sales are more space elastic. Space elasticity is the highest at the shelves in eye level, and an optimization of the shelf can increase the sales approximately 8% without affecting the costs. So that's sort of the basic algorithms behind a planogram. In planograms, you also take into account how big a package is, how many fit into the shelf. You work with stock, so you don't want to have out of stocks. You don't want to have the inventory too high because it costs. So there are some economic or financial parameters in there as well, but these are the ones that are sort of the algorithms behind the mechanical selling or sales steering. Okay, and then I'm going to show you some I think really sort of sexy results from studies undertaken primarily in the Chicago era in the 1990s. It was this trio, Xavier Drese, Stephen Hoch, and Mary Perk, who worked at the University of Chicago, and they had a great relationship with Dominique's Finer Foods, so they did a lot of experiments with them. I'm going to show you the results from a couple of those that I think are really cool. Okay, they claim that a lot of those studies by Kotzan, Curhan, and Kevin, and those that I've shown you so far, were really small, and they looked at just one aspect at a time. So they took a bunch of stores and rebuilt them and worked on them for a long period of time. And they worked with something called space to movement, which is sort of exactly what I talked about, that they adapted or they planned the planograms to fit or to be in line with the market shares. And they did shelf reorganization to enhance the decision making. So for instance, here they tailored planograms depending on if you were living in the suburb or in the city. And if you're living in the suburb, you would have a dishwashing machine, so there they would have that kind of dishwashing detergent. But if you lived in the city, you would hand wash more, so that they had more of that, for instance. So they did adjustments like this, and they found some results. They weren't too happy about the results. They didn't think they really found good or strong effects of adapting the planograms after the audience or the target market or the segment. But this is something that basically everybody's doing now. So if you have a Tesco store in one area, like a rich area, the planograms will look one way. But if you have more of a, big box standalone store, the planograms will look different. So this is something that most companies do now. They adapt the planograms after the target segment. And then they did this shelf reorganization thing, and they did two things here basically. One would be cross-category merchandising. So they would try to use frequently purchased items to generate sales for complementary, low-frequent items. And they would also like to do something called ESO shopping, which would basically be to enhance the decision making. And I think the results here are really interesting, so I'll go through them a bit in detail. When it was about cross-category merchandising, they looked at mouth care, and as you see, detergents and softener. In mouth care, the case is that you replenish your toothpaste as soon as you don't have any toothpaste left, but you do not buy a new toothbrush every time you buy new toothpaste. Actually, dentists think that a toothbrush lasts between 6 and 8 weeks, but on average, people in the UK buy a new toothbrush every 9th month. So not every 9th weeks, but every 9th months, meaning that I don't point to any of you, I can't because this is online, but a lot of you would have, pretty torn toothbrush in your bathrooms. And what they did here, actually I'll jump to the next slide, was that the planogram as it was had the toothpaste here and the toothbrushes above. And that it's easier to look down than to look up. So when you go there and pick your toothpaste, to also look at the toothbrush, you would have to do this. And this is almost like exercising. This is really heavy to look up. So you don't look up. So all they did was that they replaced the toothbrushes with the toothpaste, or they changed places. So now when you took your toothpaste, you also look down on the toothbrushes. And that simple shift nudged 8% more people to buy toothbrushes. So I think that's such a fantastic kind of easy way of showing how you can work with planograms effectively by simply understanding how, people behave. This has nothing to do with attitudes, nothing to do with brand associations. It's just the way it is. People do like this. When it comes to detergents and softener, they had liquid and powder detergent, and they had softener. And people are more careful when it comes to making sure that they have the right amount of detergent when they wash their clothes. Whether or not they have softener is not as important. Perhaps they just take a little less if they're about to run out. So what they wanted to do in this, or what they wanted to test, was to make sure that people also saw the softener when they were buying new detergents. So actually, instead of having powder, liquid, detergent, and then softener, they put the softener in between the powder and liquid detergent. So they created a bundle. And as you can see, this increased the sales of both because it both highlighted the difference between the powder and liquid detergent, but it also helped people remembering the softener. Toilet tissue, there they were exploring, you can either put it brand by brand, independent of sizes, so you have one brand in different sizes, or you could put it group it in sizes independent of brand. So either you put all packages with 12 rolls independent of brand together, and then all those with 6 rolls independent of brand together, or you put all the same brand, different sizes together. And the thing is that you don't move around a lot, so you go over to the shelf where you want to buy, and if you put it size by size, you drive sales towards the bigger packages, because people think that bigger packs are cheaper. So therefore you go there and then you buy the cheapest brand, but you buy a bigger package. If you put it brand by brand, people select brand first and then they pick the small package there because they don't want to pay as much. So actually in this case, they put it size-wise and therefore drove traffic towards, or drove sales towards the bigger packs. Cereals, I think, is interesting because here they, as you can see, both cereals and canned soup, the efforts that actually made the store sell less. And in the cereals case, they worked with segmentation. So they said, okay, cereals can be of kids kind or grown-up kind or family sort of blend. So they put all the kids cereals on one together, all the grown-up cereals together, and all the family cereals together. And by doing this, they separated all the complementary items. So if they would rather put all the Kellogg's together and so on, people would perhaps have walked up to buy something for their kids, but they would then at the same time have seen some cereals for themselves, and they would have bought both. Now that they only see kids cereal in isolation, they walk up to buy something for the kids, and they only buy one pack because they don't see anything that's complementary close by. So I think this is sort of one other very important key to how you plan a shelf. For instance, if you're a brand and if you have complementary items, it's much better for you if the store keeps all your products, all the complementary products together, because then you can sell all the things. If they put all the competing brands in one category together, the risk is that you just drive sales towards the cheaper brands and you don't sell any complementary products. And this is sort of something that you see over and over, and stores aren't always aware of these. So you as a brand owner have to be aware of it and help the store, because if you frame it to show that the store is actually also selling more and generating more margin, if they plan it the way that you want, it'll be a win-win. Both you and the store will sell more. Canned soup, I think, is another very sort of classic example. Here it was Campbell soups, and they had like 30 different flavors. So what they did was that they put them in alphabetical order. And what happens if you have it in alphabetical order? Well, say that you're there and you want tomato soup. You realize that it's in alphabetical order, so you go to tea and you pick your tomato soup. But if you have it randomized, you have to look at every can, read on every can to find the tomato soup, and then you find the mushroom soup and the whatever soup, the pea soup. So by having it randomized, they sold more. And perhaps you think that this is sort of manipulative, but to me it's very much so that if you look for tomato soup and you also find mushroom soup, that is actually a service to the shopper, because the shopper would not buy the mushroom soup unless he or she wanted the mushroom soup. The problem for the shopper is to remember at the point of purchase that they actually want the mushroom soup. And they will not remember it unless they spend at least half a second or so looking at the can of mushroom soup. So by doing it a bit harder, you actually provide the shopper with a service. And in this case, if you don't give them that service, you sell less. Shoppers will be not as happy because they will leave the store without having gotten the inspiration. They only bought what they were thinking about buying. They didn't buy anything extra. They didn't get any help that inspired them to buy something extra. So I think these are classic examples with the toothbrushes, the combination of items, both in the laundry care but also in the cereals case, and then the canned soup that you have to sort of make. You mustn't make it too easy for people to find stuff, because then they'll just buy what they planned, and they will be dissatisfied with that because they want to get help to see beyond what they can imagine themselves without the sort of help of the store. Okay, I included this just because I think it's fun. They asked shoppers if they felt confused by the rearrangements from time to time, but shoppers hadn't noticed that they had or moved things around. They felt just as confused in both cases. So obviously, you don't have to worry too much about upsetting customers by moving things around. Here they did another test just to sort of see if it had long-lasting effects, and they want to see the effects of more like the positioning by itself, the space, but also where you put something horizontally and where you put something on which level of the shelf you put something. And here you can see that the vertical effect is stronger than the horizontal effect, meaning that putting things at eye level is, as you can see, almost 3 times as effective as putting it right in the sort of horizontal plane. And here you compare location to area, and then you can see that location is 3 times as effective or efficient as area, meaning that an area would be the number of facings. So even though doubling the number of faces would generate a sales increase with 20%, putting the item at the right height is by far the most important aspect when it comes to location in the shelf. So if you as a brand is to control or choose only one aspect, being on the right shelf would be the most important thing that you could sort of contribute. And perhaps it's even worth sacrificing a number of facings by making sure that you're put on the right shelf. Okay, takeaways: store adaptive planograms of some effect. You can use frequently purchased items like the toothpaste as magnets to complementary products. You can see this more and more. There is a study that's not in here for some reason. It was in Carrefour stores from Turkey or Greece. Sorry, I can't remember. Anyhow, it's a Rogovan study with some colleagues. And they do Whole Foods. Whole Foods are planning their stores more, so they put complementary items next to each other. They put pasta and pasta sauces, rice, and various kinds of rice or Asian sort of sauces together and so on. So they do more of that. They don't put rice and pasta next to each other. Whole Foods do that. And in this Carrefour test, they tried to create dinner alternatives already in the shelf. I have that in my store as well. And this increased the sales with, as I remember, 35% on a sort of long-term kind of basis. So working with frequently purchased items to drive sales to not so frequently purchased items, but complementary ones, that's very effective. Facilitating the search process for the shoppers reduce sales. If you compare that to what I talked about in the online versus offline, where I said that it's good to have organization for the browsing, for the first step, to get the shoppers to notice your category and stop there. But then at the next step, you need to be able to actually confuse the shopper a bit, so they jump into the system 2 phase, instead of just picking what they're there to buy, what they plan to buy. You want them to really consider, is this actually the only, or is this actually the only thing that you want? So in the second phase, you want to be a bit randomized, or you want to create some disorganization to the shelf, so they have to look at each product a bit more. Important, put impulse items on shelves facing the shopper. I didn't talk about this so far, but this is that it means that the more impulse an item is, the more important it is. If you think of a store where you have shelves like this, every shelf has a eye-facing and a back-facing side. And it's often that you put a category in the same aisle. So this means that if these are 2 shelves and you come walking, this would be the eye-facing and this would be the back-facing side of the aisle in that category, for that category. And if you take, for instance, cookies and crackers, cookies would be impulse, crackers would be planned. So then you put the cookies there and the crackers there. We did exactly this test with cookies and crackers in 32 different stores. We used the Latin square, we moved it around a bit, and we followed it up by looking at, I think, 160 existing stores. And we could see that if you put the cookies so they were out of sight, you lost 50% of the cookies sales as compared to when they were seen by the shopper. But if you put the crackers that were more planned on the non-visible side, you only lost 10%. So in all the cases, if you have cookies visible and crackers that you can see, so you can see them only after you've purchased the cookies, then you're better off. So if you're selling sodas or salty snacks or anything, candy, chocolates, sweets, sorry, you need to be able to, you need to put them on the side of the shelf that's visually apparent to the shopper when they walk around the store. Okay, these are some slides showing research from Procter & Gamble and Walmart. It's called the diamonds, and it shows how much you benefit from being in the middle of the shelf. And you can see here that you it's obvious that the strongest effect is from the height. Here you see consideration sets, so the very same product put in the middle, 52% would consider it. If you put it up in the corner, only 13 or 16% would consider it. And also where you start to look. And these diamonds, they are approximately similar if you work online. It's a bit different depending on some studies show that you read from left to right and so on screens, but it's pretty much also dependent on where you have the strongest color contrast. So if you have something like this screen where you have the blue diamond or green diamond in the middle, eyes are sort of attracted by that, and then they start from there, and it's usually that you go either to the right or up and then to the right. So and of course it's a bit different. I mean, when you look at a screen, if you're comparing it to online, you don't have to move your head around to see the whole screen, but if you're standing in front of a shelf, you need to move your head. So the screen is more like only the sixth shelf. So it's similar, but not, you shouldn't compare it straight. You shouldn't just take it as the same. You need to sort of look into what it exactly means if you're working with an online retailer. But you could be very certain of that. If you need to scroll down to find your product, then you will not sell at all, or not as much as you would if you would be visible on the landing page. Okay, so we've talked a bit about brand associations and so on. Now, here I'll show you a couple of studies where we've really managed to move brand associations around depending on where the products are put on the shelf. This one I think we talked about already on Monday. Here we worked with Head & Shoulders shampoo, and we put it on the second, the fourth, and the sixth shelf, and we asked what shoppers perceive the price to be, and the prices here are in Swedish crowns, so you divide it by 10 to get it in euros, or by 12 to get it in pounds. So they say, well, it should be around €2.80 if it's on the second shelf. It should be around, well, almost €3 on the fourth shelf, and it should be over €3 on the top shelf or on the sixth shelf. And this is, as I said, like we always do, this is an experiment that's run in, I think in this case, 15 different stores, and we move it around. So it's not that one store always had the shampoo on the sixth shelf. That it's one day it's on the second shelf, the second day it's on the fourth shelf, and so on. So we're pretty certain that this is a robust effect. This is, I think, another intriguing thing. You remember that the space elasticity is 20%. So that's the private label, and this store wanted to increase the private label share, so therefore they doubled the number of facings. They also moved the cereals up one shelf. So they thought, okay, this time we will really increase the sales for the private label. But another finding that we've also talked about is that this only works for brands that people already buy, that people like. And in this case, this private label, this store chain actually wasn't really, the quality of the store chain wasn't trusted by the customers, or even the loyal customers. So the market share for this private label was from the beginning only 4%. And to understand the results that I'm about to show you, I think you should envision or try to put yourself in the situation where you go into a store and it's dominated by brands that you think are of poor quality. You go into a store and it's dominated by brands that you think have a low quality. What do you feel for that store? What do you think about that store? You don't like it because you think it's of low quality. Yes. So actually the brand's market share didn't increase with 20%. It lost. And also the whole department, the whole cereals department in this case, dropped in sales. And this store chain, they were in trouble, they were losing market share, and they did this in 20 dry food departments, like for pasta, for coffee, grains, cereals, and they had similar results in all cases. So I put here in the headings signpost brands. Signpost brands is the industry language for when you have a brand that's so strong in that category, such a strong market leader, that the shopper actually sees it as a symbol for the category. And in this case, it would be the Kellogg's. So by letting Kellogg's be dominated by the private label in this case, the trust for the whole department is lowered, and therefore the whole sort of department falls apart. Here's another example of the same thing, but it shows more the reason behind it. In this case, Yes, I think it's called Fairy in the UK, has, as you can see, the dominant space on the left-hand side, which is the before side. So you had the yellow, the purple, the green, and the see-through ones there. So they have the dominant place. And then you have the private label called Extra below. And then you have another popular sort of high-quality brand, sort of an ecological brand, Grumme, on the side. And here you can see the quality perception. So for Yes, on a scale 1 to 7, it's 588. So Yes has a strong, is trusted, their quality is trusted. But you can see that Extra is not so trusted. So what happens on the right hand side? Well, we actually we don't change any of the space. We just change the position. So Yes still has 4 shelves, but they have the 2 bottom shelves and the 2 top shelves. And they are, in this case, clearly dominated by Grumme, who gets the sort of primary space. So it's obvious to the shopper that this is the brand that the store thinks that they should buy. It's given the prominent space. And what you can see then is that it's a significant drop for Yes from 588 to 468 in quality perception. I don't know why it's not visible, but Grumme goes down from 479 to 413, and Extra goes up from 317 to 366, and all these are significant results. So you can see that the shelf to the right obviously has lower quality perceptions as a whole, and you can see that the move in quality perceptions that Yes is going through from 588 to 468 on a 7-point scale. If you were thinking about sort of taking it the other way around, from 468 to 588, I don't know, but they're saying that it would not be a cheap advertising campaign that could rise the quality perception of that brand to that extent. Taking a leap from 468 to 588 on a 7 points quality perception scale would demand a lot. But here you can see it's happening, and it's beyond the control for Procter & Gamble in this case. And oftentimes these kind of changes, they happen without anyone ever knowing about it. It's just happening. And it would be kind of bad, I think, if Procter, for instance, would, really work hard with paying a lot on TV commercials and online commercials, and then they simply didn't know about that this happened in the stores, and all their money was just wasted, because with this little shift on the shelf, they could have made the improvement, or they could have lost the benefits of the advertising like that. So I think that's a very good example of how strong the effects, the sort of metacognition of how the shopper reads the shelf, how strong it is. Okay, I thought there was one more. Obviously not. No, I moved that to another lecture. So this is a simple exercise. You don't need to do it, but if you want to play with it, you can do it, and we can talk about it. I'm sort of looking at this beer, John Smith's. This is obviously a planogram from Carlsberg, as you can see. And if you look at John Smith's ale, it's here. Which brand has the best position? Well, obviously. What would you do if you were a CMO, Chief Marketing Officer for Stella Artois? Where's Stella? There it is. What would you like to do? What do you think about the planogram for John Smith's draught? There. So you can just, if you feel like it, give it a thought. Why does the planogram look the way it does? Where would you like to be? What do you think would have an important aspect or effect for you? Well, that was all for this time. I hope you enjoyed, and I will soon be back with more. If I just get this to turn off first.